about to get caught up. Working a little faster. Okie dokie. All right. Well, we're back in the book of Romans. Romans chapter 10 today. But, last week we started back. We were in Romans 9. And remember, we listened in on a conversation between Jewish people talking about Jewish identity. And one of those places where we non-Jews need to be careful how we understand Paul's language. Because that section has led to some really bad theological interpretations. Out of that came replacement theology, the theology that the church has replaced the nation of Israel, which has given rise to a lot of anti-Semitism. It's not replacement. We know that because God holds every person as sacred in his heart. I have known a few people that believe that. A lot of other doctrines come out of that stuff. It's amazing how many different doctrines come out of different Bible passages. But we have to keep this in the back of our minds as we read Paul, because the sovereignty of God is huge for Paul. Now, we discussed that last week, and I understand, again, where most people go with the sovereignty of God. But for Paul, it was that God can do whatever he wants. But I know what most people, people will say, well, God's in control. And I always want to say, really, what do you mean by that? I mean, honestly, it's challenging for me. God's in control. Well, why did those people get cancer? Why does these wars have? Why, what is going on? How does God work in the middle of all of this stuff? And then the sovereignty, again, in our minds, we're trying to justify and understand something that we can't. We don't approach it right. The kids will tell me sometimes, they'll say, well, I'm praying to God, for they'll have something. And okay, it's good you're praying about it, but you're not going to get an answer. What do you mean I'm not going to get an answer? Because the decision's yours, and God will be with you either way you go. Because and I know that may sound like crazy to approach it, but I know how it is. God, should I do this or should I do this? People will do that, about should I be in a relationship with this person or not? And and they don't understand, and so I'm like, you're not going to get an answer. We get very, very superstitious in a lot of these things. But for Paul, this God's sovereignty is not the sovereignty to choose this or that, to choose this person and not this person, to choose this people group and not this people group. That's the sovereignty of God for Paul is the sovereignty to choose this and this in a way that transcends human limitations that we're used to. And, most people approach God in that way. well, if it's not this one, then it has to be this one. And it's almost like, well, it can't be both. We don't even have that mindset because we're either or kind of people. But for God, for Paul, he understood the sovereignty of God, rightly so. God can choose whomever he wants, and God's choosing this one doesn't exclude this one. God can choose this one and choose this one, and he has. He chose the Jews, and he's chosen the Gentiles. Our choosing is limited because we are limited. But God is not like us, thank goodness. Paul realizes that the sovereignty of God means that God is always able to choose the good because love is not a limited commodity. And in fact, if we could only see it, experience it, love is the most extravagantly common resource in the universe. You know, people's always talk about, we're going to run out of oil, we're going to run out of coal, we're going to run out of this, we're going to run out of this. Never run out of God's love. And God's choosing of us says absolutely nothing about who God is forced to leave on the outside. Again, God chose the Jews, but as we saw in the scriptures, not every Jewish person went along with God's plan. Now God chooses the Gentiles, but guess what? Not everybody's ready for that grace. And I know we think grace and, you know, people just aren't ready for it, honestly. It takes time. And this is where Paul focuses in today. What does it mean when God graciously chooses us? And then in the middle of that, and we defiantly walk away. Now, when we read Paul, well, let me say it this way. There's always many ways to read and interpret somebody. And we're talking about Paul here. There's many ways to read and interpret Paul. And I know my first interpretation of Paul was I didn't like Paul. I thought he was overbearing and rude. I loved John. Peter, I just thought it's an old country boy. But Paul, this guy, boy, he's coming with brashness, it seemed to me like he was. So there's a lot of, and you know, that'll affect the way you read. So, you know, you got to ask the question now, why do I read, why do I choose the way I do to interpret Paul? And that's something we need to ask ourselves because it uncovers something that's always happening in the background whenever we read the Bible. We're making choices about what we read. And I'm saying not what verses I'm reading, but the choices in how we understand and interpret what we're reading. And I try to, whenever I'm dealing with a difficult or controversial passage, to give you a look at how Christians have read or interpreted things over the year. A few weeks ago, we talked about the schools, you know, the Tübingen school and this kind of school. And then even Sunday, I talked about how we're influenced even before we're born to think a certain way. So again, we are always making choices when we read. And when we read Paul, Paul is writing to specific communities with specific places and specific times. And Paul is inspired by the Spirit to speak to those communities as they navigate this world-changing story of Jesus. You know, and I just find that so interesting. And, even when I think about, Paul writing to these Romans or Philippians or all of these people, there's a lot going on in and around everything. And I know, sometimes people say, well, leave the politics out of it. Don't talk about this. And, this whole scripture, I can tell you, is right in the middle of all of that. But when you can understand this, it means that in one moment, Paul might be encouraging a community, and in another, chastising one. I mean, look at Ephesians to Galatians. I mean, my gosh, in one moment, he's dealing with a specific question or a situation. And in another, he's trying to point to the largeness of the story of God. See, that's one thing that we miss when Paul makes a statement. What question was in the background here that Paul is answering? Now, we got questions here in the 21st century, whatever, and we're trying to use the Bible to answer the question, and Paul wasn't addressing that question. But when we step back from that and we realize that we are not the original audience, and that we don't always have all of the cultural memories and the context to experience the words he writes in the way that his intended audience might have, then we got a choice to make. And what I have learned, and this is the choice that I make, and it just opens up so much more, is the choice I choose is to, when I read Paul, is to read Paul through his most positive, most generous, most optimistic moments. I mean, sometimes Paul is mad. I mean, sometimes Paul is frustrated when he writes. I mean, it's there. We forget Paul is a human being. I mean, it's almost like once you come into the church and you become spiritual, you have no more emotions and you can't have that anymore. No, Paul was, I mean, I can read in Romans 8 and I mean, it's bubbling out of him. I mean, who can separate us from the love of God? He's excited and boy, and then I write you, and I'm telling you the truth. You remember how he just went from one to the other? And, we looked at all of that. But why is Paul like that? Is he bipolar? Is he, all of this stuff? No, it's because Paul loves them so much. I mean, this thing that happened to him, he's got so much love, like a father wanting the best for the children. I can promise you, nobody can aggravate you more in the entire world than your own children. Why? Because you love them so much. You have hopes and dreams, and you've carried that with them even before they were born, and, you named them and all of this other stuff, and you see them squandered away, and this is Paul. Paul is a father to these people. That's why he's that way. I always wonder, again, I listen to these people. I don't listen to them much, but, the people who are always warning the people, this is your last chance. You might die today. Then what are you going to do? And for me, and I'm going to heaven, and what are you going to do? Boy, it's going to be bad on you. And I wonder what they think. Are they going to go up into heaven and look down through a glass floor and holler, "I told you so"? Or how's it going to be? I mean, are you going to be up there celebrating because, hey, I made it? Sorry about you kids. I mean, it's just, the mentality, it just doesn't equate. And I can just see this was Paul as a father to his children. And, you know what? You're going to be persistent. If this angle doesn't work, what do? You try another angle. I mean, you're never letting up, and you're coming, and you might give him a little space, but what are you doing? You're watching. You're praying. You're watching. You're ready to pounce in. He's a father, and when you see that, then this brings light to the situation. Paul wasn't hating the Galatians. Paul knew, guys, if you go down this road, it's going to destroy you. Please don't. If I have to shake you a little bit, pulling you out of the fire is what I'm, if I got to get a little rough with it and shake you a little bit, I'm willing to do that. And if we don't know this and we don't understand this and we only see his anger and his frustration and not understand why and see his great love also, then we're going to end up with a distorted imagination of who this man is and what his relationship is with these people. I want to see Paul desperately trying to make sense of the story of Jesus and reaching out with these grand sweeping declarations of grace. Sometimes, for me, I get it. We as Americans, we don't really get it, but growing up in a primitive Baptist, really heavy on election. And that was a boom, this is it. We're the chosen and you're not. I could understand what Paul is dealing with, trying to make sense of it. And, once you understand that God is bigger than that, if God chose you, he chose you too. He didn't, in our mind, if God chose you, then he can't choose you. So I can understand Paul wrestling and trying to understand, because we don't get the 1,500 years or 2,000 years back to Abraham of this calling of God that was given, this great grace that was bestowed upon the Hebrew people. And they knew the Gentiles, and they knew all of that stuff. And now Paul is wrestling, trying to get a hold of this. And he gets it, and he's still trying to work it out. And my gosh, these pagan people who don't even know Yahweh, and they don't know Christ, but they've been chosen. How can this be? And working all this out. Sometimes at the same time, Paul makes these grand, sweeping terms, as in Adam all die. Where you come up with that, Paul? Even so in Christ shall all be made alive. Wow. We don't get the gist of that statement that Paul is making there. That statement he makes in Colossians, we talked about this a while back, that he reconciled all things on earth and in heaven. And see, we want to pick, no, he reconciled this or he reconciled that one, and he did all things. If we can get a hold of that, reconciled all things. Just let your mind try to sweep that in. And it says, by making peace through his own sacrifice. How in the world reconciles all things? Paul, why didn't you say reconciled all the good things? Reconciled all the good people, or the good people with potential. But you just included all. And these are things outside, and we went to see even the principalities and powers. How in the world, Paul? And it's because that Paul, and I hope we can see this, he writes this in the Philippian letter, that Paul is reaching out for the God who is always just beyond his grasp. Trying to apprehend that which he's been apprehended of, trying to get a hold of it. It is just there, and I can get glimpses of it. It's magnificent and wonderful. See, that's the Paul I want to keep in mind when I see him having to be a dad and play the bad cop sometimes to save his kids from the hurt that they don't see around the corner. That leads us into Romans chapter 10. Let me read verse 1. Brothers and sisters, My heart's desire and my prayer to God for them is for their salvation. Now, Paul is going to have some harsh words for his Jewish kinsmen, but we need to see that is rooted and grounded in his love for them. We're also going to see that Paul is going to keep talking about his Jewish friends, but he's going to adjust his language here to address his Gentile audience in a new way. Now, we're not going to go through every verse. We're only going to get a couple verses here in chapter 10, as a matter of fact, but that's okay. For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law, righteousness to every one who believes. I've quoted that verse many, many, many times. And you know, the thing that I like to do, and this is where I really... it's your desire, because, you know, when you read the NAS or the King James or the New Living Translations, it's still coming in the context of the language. We try to make it in our language, but it doesn't fit, does it? I mean, all these words, righteousness and, law and all of that other stuff, it just doesn't fit really in our circumstances unless we get really, really, really religious. But I like to see it where, I get it. And in this, Paul here switches into talking about them in the third person. And he's now totally switching to address the Gentiles, or is he doing something with the rhetorical device here? Kind of like, I'm looking at these people, but I'm talking about those people over there. You know what I mean? Because sometimes you would see that, like, Jesus looked at the woman and talked to the Pharisees, you know. The key to understanding this passage here is that Paul is not talking about them at all here. So then we'd have to ask, well, who is Paul talking about? Let me read it again. For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness, end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. Now, generally, we quote this verse and we go back and we look and we think, well, the them over there, they're trying to establish their own righteousness, or the them over there, or those people. Paul is talking about himself here. For I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Zeal is not based in knowledge. All of this is about Paul himself. The word zealous here, it's a Greek word here, zelos, and I didn't know this. There's some clothes out there that's made, you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, you know, like Nike. Nike's a Greek word that means victory. We call it Nike. That's how we pronounce it. Well, zelos, that's a Greek word for zealot, zealous here. And we take it to mean passionate, fervent, deeply invested in something. But actually, most of its meaning comes from a political faction that Paul was at least a little bit connected to. The Zealots. They were a political party that broke off from the established tradition of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they took up arms against their oppressors in Rome, the Zealots. Their conviction was that if they were pure in their devotion, even to the point of persecuting dissenters and violently opposing oppressors, that God would honor that and Messiah would emerge from among them and Israel would return to prominence and power. There's not a lot of different thinking today than it was even then, is it? Because they had this, when are you going to restore the kingdom? When, they would ask, well, what's going on? The kingdom, we're under oppressors, so they began to fight back. And we can see this, especially in the Old Testament. This is why this all ties together, the right-hand power, the left-hand power. And, the Zealots wanted to use this right-hand power. We want to bring in the kingdom. Why do you think they're trying to get the red heifers and build the tower? Why? We want Jesus to come back. And if we do this, we'll force him to come back. And we can get it going. And Zealots. So that's what was going on. Remember, I told you this is, everybody wants to separate. Well, get the politics out of it. This is where these politics are right in the middle of this. But this hot war here with these zealots, it doesn't break out into a hot war with Rome until about 10 years after Paul writes this letter. So war is in the air. And the tensions between the zealots in Judea and Rome are getting more heated and more heated and more heated and more heated. I mean, you tell people this and they're like, oh, no, just stay to this. But do you guys not feel something in the air? Paul is writing in this. See, earlier in the 30s and 40s, what would become the Zealot party, they hadn't even formed yet, but they're getting there. They were Jewish leaders who were aggressively persecuting other Jews who deviated from the preferred forms of Judaism, right? The Zealots. Now, who was one of these kind of people? It was Paul himself. In Acts chapter 7, here is Stephen, and Stephen has had this great revelation, and Stephen is a deacon. He's not really supposed to be preaching the gospel, is he? But he's hearing the conversation goes on, and his heart is bubble over, and he says, you men of Israel, listen, I got something to tell you, and he begins to preach this sermon, this great, great sermon, and what happens? Man, we can't stand this guy. We got to get rid of him. So they don't have much of a trial or anything. He's got to go. So these zealots, because Stephen had drifted away from what they considered true Judaism, and these zealots, as they stoned Stephen, they lay their coats down at the feet of one man named Saul. Saul is approving of their stoning. And then what happens? Paul gets letters to continue this same persecution, and Paul goes around all over the place, dragging his fellow kinsmen, his fellow Jews, out of their homes and putting them in prison. And imagine that the faction that sees that as acceptable slowly evolves into the group that wants to openly revolt against the Roman oppressors. only about 5 or 6 years after the Romans was written, the zealots, led by the captain of the temple priests, guess what his name was? Eleazar. They decided to stop offering sacrifices for the Roman Empire in the Jewish temple. Now, I know you're thinking, what? They offered sacrifices for the Romans in the Jewish temple? Yes. Why would they do that? Look, the Jews had said, the Romans come to the Jews and say, you guys are going to pay tribute to Caesar. So the Jews said, we won't pay tribute to him, but we will pray for him. We will pray for Rome. So they kind of made a little, okay, we'll pray for the emperor and for Rome. So they would kind of look the other way, you know. This is why Paul would write the Galatian letter, because the Jews weren't paying this tribute. So now what happens when the Gentiles convert? You see, I mean, we don't even think about these questions. Well, how could you tell a Jew from a Gentile? Well, remember, women couldn't go to do this stuff, so they were kind of excluded anyway. But with the men, it was pretty easy to tell. Circumcision. Go read Galatians to spy out my liberty. So when these Gentile converts would come over, this was one of the reasons that some of the Judaizers was pushing circumcision, because now you can kind of get this free pass. And Paul is like, no, guys, so Paul is trying to explain what a true follower looks like and what a true follower of Christ is, how his character is, that you didn't have to go for these external means anymore to tell who was a Jew or who was a Gentile. I mean, so you can kind of see a lot of the stuff Paul was dealing with. We don't understand that when we read, and, it would be like, okay, you got to pay a 10% tax to Caesar. But if you're a Jew, you don't have to pay a 10% tax. So when the Gentiles started coming in, hey, this is cool. I don't have to pay a 10% tax. And the Romans are like, no. We know what's going on here. Well, let's circumcise them, and then we can prove. So you can kind of see all the stuff that's going on here. But here, the zealots had decided, we're not going to pray, we're not going to offer these sacrifices anymore. Now, what does Rome do? This provokes them. I mean, by the Jews praying, it was at least lip service to the worship of the emperor. And they, like I said, they had a deal: as long as you offer sacrifices, not to, but for the emperor, Rome would look the other way and pretend they were sacrifices to the emperor. But when Eleazar says, nope, not doing it anymore, he's trying to start a war here. You know, Jesus warned him of this in Matthew 24. And Rome sees this as a sign that Judea is seceding from the empire. Again, something we might be familiar with a revolutionary war. Politics again. So this is kind of the way that the Romans would kind of come in, and they would say, okay, guys, you can have your culture, but you're still going to pay a tribute to the emperor, but we'll leave you alone, but you can't secede from the empire. So the governor, and I can't remember what his name was, it wasn't Pontius Pilate, but there was another governor to come in. He attacks. This Roman legion, he attacks. And here's the strange thing, he loses. He loses the battle, and this encourages the zealots to take control of Jerusalem. And they embark on this guerrilla warfare in the late 60s, battling back and forth. But, I can hear Bob Dylan's "With God on our side, with God on our side." So who they're thinking? God's on our side. We got Jerusalem back. Israel thinks the same thing today. We can kill all the Palestinians. God's on our side. And the dumb American people think, that's right, genocide. God's on Israel's side. It's horrible. So they go through this guerrilla warfare in the late 60s until Nero, he sends in Vespasian and then his son Titus to absolutely crush this first Jewish rebellion and destroy the temple, we know, in 70 A.D. And if you even go back earlier to the 30s, the last time Jesus rode in on Palm Sunday that we'll be coming up on here real soon, when Jesus comes up over the hill and he looks at Jerusalem and he sees the city, what happens? He begins to weep. Oh, Jerusalem, oh, Jerusalem. He said, if you had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but it's hidden from your eyes. And the days will come when your enemies will encompass the city about you. They'll encircle you. They'll hem you in on every side. And when they come in, they won't leave one stone unturned, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you, his visitation. Jesus knows all that. Jesus knows that when you go to war, you get war. And war is hell, and many people die. And, the Josephus, one of the writers, I think they said there was never a time like that, or would be again. All the destruction and cannibalism, it was a horrible, horrible, horrible time. The point being that this period from Jesus seeing war on the horizon in the 30s. Jesus saw it 40 years out. To Paul himself persecuting the Christians in the 40s. To his transformation and the writing of Romans in the 50s. To the Jewish rebellion in the 60s. To the destruction of the temple in 70 A.D., we've covered the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. This is a very volatile time in Jewish history. All of this is what Paul has in mind when he uses this loaded political language to introduce his argument here. Tensions are rising. Paul sees what's happening. Jesus tried to warn them. He's like, you guys are going to go up against the Roman Empire. They will destroy you. But they're thinking, well, God's on our side, and you're missing the point here. Tensions are rising. Paul sees what's happening, and Paul knows how this ends, because Paul has seen this happen in his own life. What I mean is, you start with good intentions, but then you let your own zeal drive you to extremes, and it ends with violence and heartache. You can watch that in politics out here. These people, they go to Washington or they go wherever, and they start out and they mean good, and because of their own zeal, now it's okay for us to oppress those people. It's okay for us to do this to these people. It's okay for the greater good. And before you know it, you're in a war. You're in a mess. Paul knows this. So Paul, he finds a way to pull together the current political climate, the rise of that zealot faction, the history of his people whose passion had become misdirected and exclusionary, not them. He did that alongside his own personal history of failure and misguided use of violence in his own story. And when Paul says, "For I can testify about them," Notice what Paul says. He's not, I can testify about them that they are zealots. They're zealous for God. He's saying, look, I can talk about that story because that story is my story. And Paul is actually saying this story, that story, it's all really the same story anyway. And what was the story? That we did not understand the righteousness of God, and so we sought to establish our own. This is a major theme for Paul, that God always chooses the good, and that we always start in God's grace, that God always welcomes us back whenever we are ready, but if we choose, we can walk away from all of it. This choosing your own path, this creating our own righteousness, this is what Paul means when Paul talks about, as he did in chapter 1, the judgment of God. Paul has already developed that idea way back in Romans 1:24 and 1:26 and 1:28. And again here in Romans chapter 11, verse 8, God gave them over. Romans here says God gave them a spirit of stupor or confusion. God gave them over. Remember, God gave them over to a reprobated heart. God gave them over to this. God gave them over. That God gave them over is one Greek phrase, and it's paradidomai. It's a big old word. And it has the idea, and you can check this out, to give over or to entrust to someone or something. I'm going to entrust you with this. This is what we saw last week, what Paul is doing with the story of Pharaoh. Remember, we're thinking again, God's hardened Pharaoh's heart, and God hardens this one. So if God hardened Pharaoh's heart, then God's responsible for the sin. Well, no, God's not responsible for sin, but he made Pharaoh a mean guy. It's not that God makes people do bad things. God is only ever for us all. But the idea here is that when we choose what is wrong, God will entrust you with your own choices. He entrusts you with those choices. You see this all the way back in the beginning of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Okay, this is what you want. I'm going to entrust you with it. I mean, to break this down a little bit, maybe, young couple, and they're talking about getting married, and man, you guys aren't ready. It just, it's going to be tough. But what do? You entrust them with the choice that they're going to make. And the judgment of that choice is you suffer through it. And some make it, and some don't. And in the middle of that, God did not leave them on their own. He walked with them through it. Some saving the marriage if they receive instructions, counsel, whatever, but still allow the choosing. And you know what God, one of the things he does, remember, everything is redemptive. And, I think the kid, he comes in and you've just instructed the child, I've just cooked some soup on the stove. The eye is still hot. Don't put your hand on the stove. You'll burn your hand. And the kid is like, and he puts his hand on the stove. And he burns his hand. Now, I'm upset, right? Because I just told you not to do that. So now what do? He's just burned his hand on the stove. I told him not to do it. Now, this is the religious mindset is, now what I could do is throw some more on him, put his face on the stove, put the other hand on the stove, and cover him up with lighter fluid. You know what I mean? That would be kind of stupid, wouldn't it? Now, I may be talking to him as we are trying to heal the wound, right? Our main point here is to heal the wound and learn the lesson, not to pile on more, which most people think God does. And the God that we know doesn't do that. The God, they don't know who the true God is. I mean, how do we pray? Our Father. You being evil know how to give good. How much more does our Father know? So Paul says, we did not understand the ways of God, so we sought to establish our own rather than submit. And God said, okay. Imagine the zealots. They think, imagine Paul. He thinks, I'm doing God a favor here. I don't know, maybe God's on a journey. Maybe God is patting his foot. Is somebody going to step up and really get these people straightened up? And Paul says, you know what? I see what you're doing, God. I know what you want, and we're going to do this. Grab some swords, get the letters, and let's go. And all you people over here doing the wrong thing, man, we're going to put you in jail because God has got a straight and narrow path, buddy, and you've deviated, and we're going to lay it to you. Good job. We're going to get it. And then when we're done, God's going to say, well done, my good and faithful servant. You have done it, man. You've straightened it all up. But in the middle of that, you know what God says? Okay, Paul, if that's what you want to do, knock yourself out. We'll try your way and see what happens. I'll stay as close as you let me. And whenever you're ready to come home, it's your choice. And this is a fundamental paradox of believing a good God who loves a broken world. God always chooses us, but many times, oftentimes, we don't choose God back. And Paul says later in this chapter that God chose the Israelites, but not all the Israelites chose God. Again, I'm paraphrasing here. You go read the rest of this chapter with what I'm telling you in mind, and it's like, oh, I get it, I see. Because love requires choices, and choices make mistakes, and mistakes need grace, and yet God, in the middle of all that, remains faithful to us because that's the good news. Paul's argument here is that we've all tried to make our own righteousness. All of us have. Whether that's the zealots who want war with Rome, just like the Israelites who thought their chosenness was to the exclusion of everyone else, just like those who think they can force people into the kingdom at the threat of violence, scare them with God's wrath. Boy, you know what, today, what happens if you die on the way home? You better get saved today, or right now, this could be it. We'll scare them into the kingdom. What are we doing? Trying to establish our own righteousness. And then we tell ourselves, I hear this on the radio all the time, I'm the one telling you the truth. All the other preachers ain't telling you the truth. And I got to tell you the truth. And I'm the one that's telling you the truth. Why? Because we're doing good for God. And God wants us to go do good for him. And God is sitting up there thinking, man, I'm glad I got you. I don't know what I would do without you. The world would just go to hell in a handbasket. But I got you to tell the truth. And it's like, we're just dumb. And they don't have this understanding. They have no understanding. They're going about to establish their own righteousness. And Paul is saying, guys, we've all done it. And we tell ourselves we're doing good. It's for the greater good. So we justify it. And God's judgment in the middle of that is he lets us do it. Because I always wondered, God, why do you let this go on? You ever asked that question? Tim, why do you let these TV preachers get all this money? Why don't you stop it? Why don't you stop it? You could just easy, quick, and then maybe I'll go about to try to stop it myself. This is what we do. So good at it. Whenever I find myself going down an unhealthy path, and I justify it to myself, then it slowly becomes okay. You see what I mean? I justify my greed, then I slowly become a greedy person. And so on and so on. Until you find yourself cut off from this expanse of the grace of Jesus. You're like, how did I get here? One little step at a time. This is how it works for Paul. You start down a good path and with good intentions and passionate zeal, and you do your best. But if you don't constantly course correct, you end up somewhere you never intended. It's what happens to all of us, regardless of how pious we are. The only antidote for Paul, remember in this chapter, this is where they come up with the sinner's prayer, right? Call out to Jesus and be saved. And all of, now you can kind of see, because we're on a bad course here. The only antidote for Paul is about knowing precisely where your righteousness is taking you. For Paul, when righteousness and religion are the point, then we've already missed the point. So he writes that our righteousness doesn't work. But everything changes when we realize that Christ is actually the culmination, the end of the law, so that there will be righteousness for everyone. It says who believes, but really who trusts. Again, not a mental thing. This is a trust. And this is one of Paul's core ideas, that it is the righteousness of Jesus, the faithfulness of Christ, that opens up a new way forward for us. Even when we find ourselves headed in the wrong direction, it's God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness in Jesus to do everything God can do to get us and bring us back home. The key here is recognizing this word end, culmination, end. It's the word telos, end. And it doesn't mean end like, well, that's the end of the story. It's not end as in abolishment of the law or the termination or something. It's more like end as in the point or the purpose. Jesus would say, I didn't come to abolish the law, I come to fulfill the law. Paul's point to his Jewish friends is that the law is good. Always was, always is, because rules are helpful and zeal is great, assuming they lead you to Jesus. Because if not, if rules make you arrogant and religion makes you violent, and if righteousness makes you pull away from people instead of leaning into people, then it doesn't matter what scripture you quote to back it up. If your righteousness does not look like the grace and peace of Jesus, then it missed the mark and it took you away from God. And this is what it means for us to have Jesus at the center of our faith. Religion is like looking through a glass darkly, but to see Jesus, to watch Jesus, to follow the way that Jesus moves through the world and interacts with the people that are near him. And for Paul to see that Jesus is willing to die for what he believes in, but never to kill for it, that's something that ought to be remembered. He's willing to die for it, but not to kill for it. This is the righteousness of God that takes the initiative and invades our world and saves us all from our own ideas about what religion should be. Righteous was never about being enough. That's kind of how we do it. Jesus was made righteous for us, like, okay, we was not enough, and now he's made us enough somehow. It was always about discovering who to trust. And when you find yourself at the end of that road that you never intended to go down, and you feel the full weight and the judgment of your choices, maybe like Paul looking around and wondering, how in the world could I have caused so much pain? And now the good news for Paul is that this is also the place, somehow, strangely, where God's grace meets you on the road to Damascus, in the worst place you've called the maximum amount of pain, and God meets you there. You would think God would meet you halfway while you're on the way back. But it reminds you that you are loved and offers you the way of Christ as a replacement for all of your best and broken efforts. And this is the good news for Paul, that righteousness wasn't what you thought, but more importantly, God wasn't who you imagined. And in all of our messes, in all of our arrogance, in all of our violence, we are already perfectly loved. That is the righteousness, the love, the acceptance of God that once fully understood, and I'm going to add this word metabolized. You know what? Metabolized, digested, and becomes a part of us. Then it will transform you into everything God imagines you to be. And I'll close with this. Trying harder will save anybody. But knowing you are already perfectly loved will change everything about you. And if we can know this now, God is always for us. And may we recognize God's judgment in our life as what wakes us up. I was telling the kids today, they just don't recognize it because people live in a numb world. And God will leave you alone with your choices, but when you're so uncomfortable, feel it, you should rejoice. Hey, I'm in the judgment of God. But go read this chapter. Those who cry out to God, He what? Saves and rescues them. That's right. That's all true. But if you're just numb, and I believe there's scriptures for that too, isn't it? To recognize God's judgment in your life as what awakens you. Then what? You can be glad for even the judgment, because I was doing all this and I meant well and I found myself here, but I can still be saved. May Christ's righteousness come to hunt you down and become you, and may you then move through the world with the grace and peace that reflects the heart of God, which was once obscured in religion and now revealed completely in the Christ. I will say amen, and we will quit with that.